Today on History's Tech, we are looking at a new series on different types of ships, and we're going to be starting it off with the frigate. Now, the frigate is a rather interestingly named ship, as in the modern day era, while some navies can kind of agree on the role of a frigate, others kind of rename theirs as different names, like a corvette or destroyer, or even cruiser, depending on its usage. So, today we're going to kind of be looking at the overview of the nomenclature of it, the name, and where does it come from and how it has evolved to where it is today. Now, the frigate as we know it basically comes from the 1600s, and at that time it meant any fully rigged ship that was built for speed and maneuverability, and it was basically intended to be a scout vessel, an escort, or one that could do a patrol type role. Now, that name actually derives from the 1580s, and there was a group of privateers known as Dunkirkers. And the Dunkirkers actually built these small, maneuverable sailing ships that were designed to take on the Dutch and their allies in basically like a raiding format: get in there quick, attack, and leave. Now, because of the success of these ships and their overall design was actually really good, many navies actually started copying it, including the very Dutch Republic that was being attacked by the Dunkirkers. And they actually became the first navy to build purpose built ocean going frigates. And it's at this point we see a lot of navies developing their own versions of the frigates, or at least calling it a frigate. And we get other types of frigates known as the two deckers, which are called great frigates or great ships. The name actually starts being interchanged with cruisers and things like that as we start seeing these bigger and bigger frigates being replaced with larger and larger ships. Now, by the time we get to the Napoleonic Wars, we're starting to see more of a standardized frigate. And they're based off of a French ship known as the Midi. And the Midi is kind of seen as this example of what's known as a true frigate. It had a lower deck, um, much more of a simplified design. They didn't have multiple decks of guns, typically just one. And the idea was that they were going to make this ship lighter, faster, but still had enough firepower to at least do some damage. And the Royal Navy is actually going to capture these ships and begin copying them for themselves. Now, the British, not allowing the French to outdo them, do develop what's known as a heavy frigate. This is a new, larger, improved version of that true frigate. And it's going to carry about 26 main guns on board of it, sometimes 28. It's going to still allow it to handle the speed and better maneuverability, but with more firepower. And this evolution of frigates is going to continue as we get into super heavy frigates. And it's actually going to start with the Swedes, who didn't have enough ship of the lines. And since frigates were easier and cheaper to produce, they decided to produce their own frigate. However, they wanted it to be able to stand up against the heavier frigates that were appearing. So they came up with their own super heavy frigate. And several navies are going to follow this, including the United States with their own super heavy frigate, the USS Constitution. Now, because of their ability to be so fast, so maneuverable, and make an excellent patrol vessel, reconnaissance vessel overall, and were smaller and faster than ship of the lines and easier to produce, frankly, and cheaper, they were very popular into the early to mid 1800s. However, by then, the age of sail was starting to go away, and it was time to replace it with the age of steam. During the 1830s, we're going to see navies begin experimenting with paddle steamers by equipping them with large guns mounted on one deck, and this became known as the paddle frigate. This development would actually be immediately followed by frigates that still looked a little bit more like a traditional or true frigate, with steam engines and now screw propellers instead of paddles, and these became known as screw frigates. And with the emerging age of the ironclad warship, we're going to see frigates once again change. By adding all this armor plating to a frigate, we're going to get what's known as an armored frigate. Interestingly enough, ironclad warships, by definitions, meet many of the qualifications to technically be a type of frigate. However, they end up getting their own name on their own. Now, one of the most famous of these armored frigates is going to be the HMS Warrior of the Warrior class ironclads. And it is going to be that mixture of the armored frigate or an ironclad, but we're going to refer to it as an armored frigate. And it's at this point in the development of the armored frigate that we're eventually going to see the end of the frigate, at least being used in terms of a name. Instead, what we see is navies around the world switching away from the frigate to new armored ships that they are redesignating as battleships or armored cruisers or protected cruisers. And this is going to become the future of naval warfare, at least into the early 20th century. Now, the name frigate will come back into popularity during the Second World War when the British readopt the name for a new class of anti submarine ship. And this ship is going to be larger than a corvette, but smaller than a destroyer. And so this in between class becomes known as the frigate. Now, essentially, the British are going to be the only ones to call their ships of this size as frigates. The Americans will actually name theirs destroyer escorts until the 1970s. And the British continued their development of the frigate basically as a replacement for failed ships. And one of these actually becomes known as the Lock class. And they actually developed what's known as an anti aircraft frigate, similar to the United States destroyer escorts. But instead of being focused on an anti submarine war, they were an anti aircraft. And this was going to lead them into patrol gunboats, which they called the patrol frigate, that the Americans actually start naming their own ships, known as the Tacoma class frigates, which were their patrol gunboats. And it's after the Second World War that we see once again the role of the frigate change, as there's now a need for a new type of frigate. Because these are small, fast, very maneuverable ships, they can now be equipped with the new surface to air missiles, making them guided missile frigates and the future of naval warfare. And this is where we start to get into kind of a mess. The United States is still calling their vessels ocean escorts and DEs, or destroyer escorts. And eventually they decided in 1975 to change their ships to the frigate as well. The Canadians did this in the 50s, and it really wasn't until the 90s that countries like the French really began to utilize the frigate as a term for their ships. So even to this day, ships of a similar size are not all called frigates. Today, the role of the frigate basically takes on the role it had during the Second World War, only as a modern day ship. New modern anti submarine versions of the frigate allow it to take on basically a wide array of different types of ships, being equipped with variable depth sonars or towed arrays, carrying torpedoes. Some of them even carry mine capabilities, or surface to air missiles for protection, or surface to surface missiles for protection. We even see anti air rolls. These are equipped with a suite of anti aircraft guns and missiles to allow them to protect all types of situations and scenarios. Now, because like its predecessors, it is easier to produce and cheaper to produce, a lot of navies around the world are really starting to rely on the frigate as part of their mainstay of their fleet. Because of this, we are seeing the next generation of frigates start to emerge with capabilities unlike any other, including anti ship rolls with the ability to carry hypersonic missiles, long range missile rolls with the ability to carry cruise missiles and vertical launch tubes. And so the frigate is in a position where it's going to be around for a very long time. But there you go, a quick look at the development of the frigate, why its name may not be as popular as some other ships out there, but to this day, the frigate has a role in navies around the world that is not going away anytime soon. But that's it for today. I thank you for joining me, and I look forward to talking to you the next time when I start talking about destroyers, cruisers, and a whole lot of other types of ships.